Hello, welcome to the latest installment of David Galata Book Dreamer. I'm David Galata, and I'm going to be talking more about the Crucible Spirals Trilogy, which is my own work, starting with Crew of Ganges, then Veil of Strife, and ending with Painful Medicine. Today I'd like to talk about something that shows up quite a bit in the books, and that is Magbikes. What is a Magbike? For the first 1,000 spirals, or years as we would know it, Ganges really didn't have a lot of small transportation, relying mainly on public transportation and large vehicles, large transports within the ship. And this meant that the individual really mainly walked or used a tram or a train or the tubeways in order to get from one area to another. But there really wasn't much left for the idea of a recreational vehicle until it was invented by an engineer from engineering sector, of course. However, this engineer's work was passed aside by the invention board. There's a council that oversees new inventions to see if they're good for the holy mission of terraforming and to see if there might be any unforeseen problems with any new invention. And they felt that his really wasn't necessary, and so they weren't going to make it official. He was quite heartbroken and actually ended up leaving the sector in order to pursue building his own little workshop to build Magbikes. All of the roads within Ganges have a bare metal deck that all the vehicles use, and the vehicles mainly use magnetic impellers to lift them above the deck. And this doesn't really work on rock or turf or anything like that. It's only for the roads themselves. So the roads themselves are just this bare polarized metal, and it's been heavily polarized because of all the magnetics running across it. And he wanted to make something that could go faster and that could be used off-road. He first developed the Magbike to be used on the deck plating roads of Ganges, and was able to miniaturize some of the magnetic impellers. For example, he used the ones from the construction vacuum suits that they use for building space structures when they get to a new world. They have to have large orbitals that have to be built out there, and mag boots are a big deal. You don't want to be floating off into the middle of space. So he ended up utilizing those as two platforms that would hold up the body of a bike, like a bicycle-like structure that had handlebars and a seat, and that would levitate the bike. Now what he needed, though, was thrust. And for thrust, he again scrounged used parts. Old parts that were going to be recycled or, didn't fit certain specifications for surveillance pods and tugs, which are used as spaceborne vehicles. And he started using their thrusters for the back of his bike. So you have a levitating bike with a pod thruster sticking out the back right behind the rider, and these things moved like rockets without any real friction to have to deal with. They were the fastest vehicles in Ganges. They attracted certain people who liked being independent, people who wanted to have a little thrill, and having some fun, and they started making their own because he didn't want to sell them. Anytime he tried to sell them, the sectors would come down on him that he was profiting by making chips. Remember, it's a voluntary economic system in Ganges. And that he was becoming wealthy by selling improper vehicles. So he couldn't sell them, but he could teach people how to make their own. And so groups of people were getting together and building their own mag bikes. Then they wanted bikes that could be used off-road. And so he went back to history and discovered that such a vehicle did exist on ancient Terra. And that was called the motorcycle. Only here he wanted to keep the pod thruster design. But instead of having the magnetic impellers, there were wheels. He also felt that for stability's sake, especially for off-road, he didn't want anything too thin. So these tires that they used were extra wide, mainly because the only wheels he could find were used for transports that were large, public transportation vehicles or construction vehicles, and these had very large wheels. So you have oversized wheels on this thing that is being propelled by a spaceship's thruster, now roaming all over the ship. This eventually led to the formation of enthusiast gangs. The sectors tried to stop them. The sectors started coming down on people for belonging to these unofficial organizations, considering them a menace to the general population. This didn't stop anyone. If anything, it had the opposite effect, and you ended up with gangs. So yes, there were space bikers in Crew of Ganges. In fact, the main character, Marik Langman, is a space biker. They call them Rattlers. Because of the engine pod sitting on these things, the whole framework would shake like crazy. And the local communities called the riders of these things Rattlers because they were being shook up like a rattle. The Rattlers didn't mind the moniker. In fact, they considered it a badge of honor that they could control these very wild vehicles. And the popularity of them grew. Problem is, some of these gangs, because the members of them had been disgraced from their sectors or removed, lowered in rank, they began to, sell illicit things. They began to get involved in what they called scratches, which are fights, more like counting coup. Very few people were actually killed during these scratches. The idea of the scratch was to basically count coup and to destroy the mag bikes of an opponent gang. And they started vying for territory and vying for reputation. By the time Crew of Ganges appears, where you have the Crucible Spirals beginning, these Rattler gangs had gotten a little out of control. And some of them were becoming more and more violent. And it was beginning to shove out the less violent gangs and the more post-sensitive gangs. And this was a problem. And it was one of the reasons why Marik left the Rattler gang that he was part of, called the Roadhawks. And every gang did have names. There were the Wild Children, there were the Lone Wolves, there were all different kinds of names that these gangs used. The Scratch Hogs, obviously one of the more violent of the Rattler gangs. And this whole situation where they're competing with each other led to a horrific incident in which Marik was involved because he was a chief of the Roadhawks. He was the leader. And a couple of people died, and someone ended up in medical sector for the rest of her life because of a stunt that he pulled. And he just left it all behind to become a bodyguard, and thus begins the story. The Rattlers were very inventive in their Magbikes. They would put trophies on them. They would put flags, badges of prowess and of loyalty to their gang. Many of them were highly decorated with fetishes and all kinds of things on their bikes. Same thing with the clothing they wore. They had to wear heavier clothing because they didn't have a protective coating of metal around these things. They were out in the open, and so they started wearing heavier clothing and synth leather clothing, which had normally been used in industrial working conditions. They were using them while riding their Magbikes to protect them when spills occurred. It wasn't a matter of if, it was always a matter of when. These things really were jury-rigged, and no two were alike. Every person built their Magbike to their specifications, to their wants and desires. So you would see a dozen Magbikes going down the road, and all of them, each one of them was unique. The only thing that tied them together were the badges and trophies of loyalty. That would remain the same. They would wear their colors, as we would say today. Later on, Marik ends up inventing a new kind of Magbike where it has both tires and magnetic impellers. He found a way of lifting the wheels up on hydraulics so that the Magbike impellers could keep it nice and steady on a metal road. And then those wheels could lower down and be used on rough terrain where there was no magnetic surface in which to ride upon. That invention changed the way Magbikes were viewed. Remember, it's not the wheels themselves that are propelling them. It's the thruster pod, the pod thruster rather, that's attached to it behind the rider that is pushing them along. These were not combustion engines. They were plasma thrusters, which had fuel cells. And that was also part of their illicit trade, was getting the fuel cells they needed. Later on in the books, the Magbike becomes an important feature, and it is used in the mutiny or civil war, if you prefer. Depends on who you're talking to. And that particular device, the Magbike, became very, very important. It allowed squads of fighters to get around quickly and efficiently. It created really interesting tactics that you couldn't do with larger vehicles. So the Magbike became a major component of the Crucible Spirals and the war that ensued. So I hope that you have enjoyed this little video. I enjoy making these, by the way. To my subscribers, thank you so much. Please help spread the word. I am going to continue making these no matter what, because I find it delightful. And please feel free to comment and contact me. I'd love to hear from you. So in the meantime, I hope you all have a wonderful week, and happy reading, everyone. Please take good care of yourselves.